talking about a Salajiqa, we're talking about the Toloniya, we're talking about Khawarizmiya, we're talking about so many different dynasties that were ruling in different areas. But then it was slowly going out of hand. When it was going out of hand, then that let other invasions start to seek different ways to disempower the Muslim governance. And that's when the Mongols came in. That's when the Mongols came in, and that's when the Mongols came in, that's when the Crusaders came in, and that acted as another type of invasion that the Muslims at all did not expect. And that was in um, 656. That was the end. I put 565 last time. It was actually 656 Hijrah. That was the end, or at least for a number of years, that was the end of an Islamic ruling. Never did the Muslims think that they were going to go that weak where they will not actually govern on their own, where they are left without any leader. In fact, they started thinking that it was the end, and it was the end of the world, and it was Yawm al-Qiyamah. It was the sign of Yawm al-Qiyamah, and that the Mongols were Ya'juj wa Ma'juj, and that was basically just the end of Islam and end of the Muslims. Now you look at those different expansions, the implication that it has today is, as you could see, Muslims covering those parts of the map, but this is pretty much, we're looking at those that 10 to 50% you could see in, scattered around in different parts of the world. But in general, there was a lot of influence in our modern times with the different crusade invasions, or the 9 crusade invasions that had come to close relations with the Muslim world. And that brings in a lot of influences that affected the Muslim thinking in many ways. But this is going really fast. But it's really important to see, how do we find the differences in that transition from one era to another, and what are the implications that it had on the evolution of Muslim thinking. Now we're going to go deeper. So now we're going to scrutinize, after we did all this fast scanning of the Muslim history and what happened. But now we're going to go deeper to see what implications did those changes have on the Muslim thinking throughout history. And in other words, the form of the evolution of Muslim thinking. So during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the foundation of Islamic thinking, of course, was there. The differences did exist, but they were very limited, because during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ was the one to go to in case of any dispute. And the other part is the ideological foundations of Islam were laid out. In other words, the differences were very limited. And by the way, the issue of Shi'ism / Sunnism was a very major point in a lot of those different parts of Islamic history, whether we're talking about the Fatimiyin, or whether we're talking about Al-Abbasin, or we're talking about Bani Umayyah. All those different times in history did have major points that you cannot separate. You can't turn a blind eye on the issue of Shi'ism and Sunnism and the implications it had on one, the foundation itself, the foundation of Islamic mind, the Muslim mind, and also let's do it that way. Maybe we can lay it out for those visuals, whether you're talking about the foundation and what acts as a resource, and who acts as a resource. Do we consider Abu Huraira as a resource? Do we consider Sayyidah Aisha as a resource? Or do we only consider as Al Bayt? And later, of course, that had its political impact. The political impact, the political impact in whether it's the split of Al Fatimiyin or Dawla Al Ubaidiyya, controlling a vast area, and how it wanted to control in order to spread that Shi'ism, and how it later affected. I mean, you're talking about Al-Azhar, which is actually founded by Al-Ubaidiyyin themselves, slash Al-Fatimiyin. Al-Ubaidiyyin are the same thing. But the ideological foundation during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, of course, it was laid out. But after the era of the Prophet ﷺ, that Shia-Sunni split after Ali ibn Abi Talib, that brings in major frictions, which even affects what resource do we regard. I was just, this is a little off topic. I just had somebody asked a question. And this was a question that many times people ask me: what is the ruling on a Sunni woman marrying Shia man, or the opposite? There's no doubt that the marriage itself is not zina, meaning it is not a batil, it is not an invalid marriage, but it's a valid marriage. But when we look at, will I encourage such a marriage? The answer is no. Why? Because if you have a foundation, if the main basis for any thought you disagree on, well, the result is going to be agreeing on many details. If we go to a specific foundation, so let's say this woman says, well, the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Bukhari that Abu Huraira said the Prophet ﷺ said such and such and such. He's going to say, well, I don't even believe in Bukhari. I don't even believe in Abu Huraira. I consider Abu Huraira being a man of hating the Sahaba. He'll even go for takfir for Abu Huraira, or even go for takfir for Sayyidah Aisha, or even consider all that. Now, can she use that as a reference? Well, he won't agree on it. And that's the same thing. So when you look at the ideological foundation, you cannot separate that from the details of it, from the effects and the influences that it will have on the details. It will not only in terms of a fatwa is mut'ah halal or is mut'ah haram. That's not the only thing that we're talking about here, but we're actually talking about, even politically speaking, the influences and the challenges later also rose on a political level, in where who is considered as a legitimate ruler and who's not considered as a legitimate ruler. If you say an illegitimate ruler, that would actually mean you have the right to kill that ruler. And if you say that this is a legitimate ruler, that means you have to abide by their rules and laws. This is not talking about just an issue of, yeah, we disagree on that point or this point. This would actually talk about the ideological foundation, and even a major split within the Muslim nation here. So during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was really simple. There was an ideological foundation. They would go back to the Prophet ﷺ. But then the good news also is that the differences, the Prophet ﷺ during the era of the Prophet ﷺ, the differences, the Prophet ﷺ would be the one to turn to, and he would explain why it's accepted or rejected. Just like, for example, the very famous story where the Prophet ﷺ would actually tell the Sahaba that they should not pray Asr unless they reach the land of Bani Qurayza. Well, some of the Sahaba, the land of Bani Qurayza, they basically commit treason, and they were really preparing to let the people of Quraysh go through their land in order to bring an end to Islam. Well, to make the story short, the Prophet ﷺ, then after the separation of Quraysh, and with that typhoon coming in, then it was time to deal with Bani Qurayza. Well, the Prophet ﷺ told the Sahaba that they should go directly and not pray Asr till they reach the land of Bani Qurayza. They reached the land of Bani Qurayza, but guess what? In the middle of the way, they start having disputes because Asr time was about to pass. So some Sahaba would consider that no, the Prophet ﷺ didn't literally mean that we pray Asr in the land of Bani Qurayza. He was more intending that we hurry. The other group of Sahaba said, no, we're going to take his words in their literal meaning, their literal phrasing, and we're only going to pray Asr when we reach the land of Bani Qurayza. Well, they reached the land of Bani Qurayza, but it was too late, but they still prayed in response or in obedience to the Prophet ﷺ, prayed in the land of Bani Qurayza during a different time, but they just implemented what the Prophet ﷺ had told them. Well, the Prophet ﷺ, he looked at in both situations and approved that both did the right thing. Well, didn't go far really. The Prophet ﷺ was there to end the misinterpretation, the misunderstanding, the confusion, whatever it is, and both were considered as having a legitimate interpretation. Generally speaking, the foundations of Islamic sciences were taught to the companions. The Prophet ﷺ was there, he was teaching them Islam, and that later affected the Sahaba in helping them grow to understand Islam. Well, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, things were going towards a different direction. Although the basis and the principle on how to deduce and how to derive Islamic rulings, they were laid out, and the righteous Sahaba, the Sahaba were there, the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the best of the scholars of Sahaba were there. So between 11 and 41 Hijrah, they were still able to consult one another. The most important scholars of the Sahaba were there. So it wasn't really strong of a differences of opinions, at least to a certain extent. But then one of the challenges arose, and that challenge was really with the vast expansion within the Islamic territories. Now we're seeing many non-Arabic territories right now being brought into contact with Muslims. These non-Muslim territories, they had many cultures, many issues, many religions, and of course were not specifically covered by in text. The Prophet ﷺ never talked about, for example, Buddhists, and never talked about al-Majus. Well, did talk about al-Majus. That's actually in the Quran, but never talked about if we were to deal in a political and really rule them, are we going to deal with them the same way that we're dealing with Ahlul Kitab, or is that going to be different? How are we going to deal? Are we going to consider them just like Kuffar Quraysh, in where there can't be any marriage, the biha is haram, etc.? That brought in more questions and more situations that required a revision, that required studying. Now, the legal rulings became increasingly necessary. And because these legal rulings became necessary, but the righteous khulafa, they were there to discuss it, like I said. The Sahaba in general followed decision-making procedures in where they would help one another to avoid mistakes in finding rulings. The presence of the righteous Sahaba were there to say, well, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say this, I did this, I saw him do this. The last thing, or even to see the dating of the situations based on not necessarily number dating, but based on events. That this happened during the time of Uhud, this happened during the time of Hunayn, what abrogates, what comes, what precedes an event, which one comes first, etc. Well, later, after that time, now we go into, after the death of the Sahaba, now we go into a different era. This is the end of the Khulafa al-Rashidin time, and this is during the Umayyad Era. The Umayyad Era was actually starting to bring in a different a different type of an evolution, let's say it that way. Well, this evolution brought in two major perspectives in dealing with looking at the text and how we review the text. The first group was more into Ahl al-Ra'i, in where let's evaluate the different schools, let's evaluate the different opinions, and let's look at the causes. Let's scrutinize the principles behind the rulings. Why couldn't they just go back to Hadith? Well, they didn't reject a Hadith, but because Ahl al-Ra'i were more headquartered in Iraq, and in Iraq at the time was pretty much considered the heated area, the most heated area with all those different religions, different cultures, people that spoke so many different languages. Until the time of today, Iraq is considered as the area, because if you even look at it geographically, the Iraq is that area. Iraq is this area that divides two different historical traces. You're talking about Iraq being that major point between the Persian Empire and between the Byzantine Empire. Not only that, you have Iraq in where you've got Ashuriyin have a language, and you've got Zaydiyya have a different religion, and you've got Shias also pretty much in Iraq. You had all those divisions of different kinds of Christians, different kinds of Jews, different kinds of the Majus, different kinds of so many different religions, so many different ideologies, and that let the scholars like Abu Hanifa, because of the so many different groups working to support their ideas, they were willing to make up a hadith. They were willing to make up a hadith, and they were willing to lie about the Prophet ﷺ. So Abu Hanifa, due to that, was depending on a lot of, let's say, scrutinizing and analyzing the different situations of that where we understand the principles of the hadith and the different situations, circumstances that surrounded a hadith. So although it is called Ahl al-Ra'i, but to consider and think that Ahl al-Ra'i means that they depend on their own opinion and not hadith is absolutely wrong. It's not that they did not depend on a hadith, but the resource of a hadith were not yet as abundant as in comparison with Ahl al-Hadith. Ahl al-Hadith was more in al-Madinah. They had access. Al-Madinah was pretty much the headquarters of Islam. It was where Islam was the first governance of Islam. The first authority of Islam was in Medina. That made it easy to get access to the Sahaba, to the Tabi'een, to the Sahaba, to the Tabi'een, to the Tabi'een, etc. Unlike Ahl al-Ra'i, which was in Baghdad, and there were many people that were willing to make up a hadith, willing to make up their own even ayah. They were willing to go really far. It was an area that was very contaminated with a lot of different groups and different ideologies, and people willing to support their ideas and make up a new religion. They don't care. So that's why Abu Hanifa, they were considered Ahl al-Ra'i, in where they were scrutinizing the text. But here's one thing. It's very important to keep note that Abu Hanifa himself, if we look at it, I'm going to go to a map, to just this dating right here. If you look at Abu Hanifa himself was actually born 80-year Hijrah, dies 150 Hijrah. You compare that, you keep an eye on the place. You keep an eye on the political situation that was surrounding that place, and you also keep an eye on the cultural circumstances that were surrounding the place, and you also look at during the time. During this time, the compilation of hadith did not yet start, or at least even if it did start with Imam Malik writing his book al-Muwatta, it was still considered, it's in the nuanced period, it was still in the beginning of it. And that's why Abu Hanifa didn't really have much access to a lot of the resources that Imam Malik had. Imam Malik had Sahaba, or at least the Tabi'een, were actually there. And it was said that Imam Malik even met with, I believe it was Anas ibn Malik himself. So when you look at Malik, even though Malik ibn Anas is not the grandchild of Anas ibn Malik, all right? So when you look at Malik, Imam Malik, the circumstances, the political situation, the access to the information, let's say it that way, the political situation was a lot more stable, and still it wasn't that far from the era of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's why it was capable of maintaining Ahl al-Hadith. It was capable. So does that mean that Abu Hanifa rejected hadith? So how come Abu Hanifa, there were some of the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari that Abu Hanifa did not take? Well, you got to keep in mind, al-Bukhari died 256 Hijriya. In other words, al-Bukhari, when he even started the hadith collection and working on that hadith, Abu Hanifa was way long dead, a long time ago. Abu Hanifa died 150 year hijrah. Al-Bukhari was born many years after that. Would Abu Hanifa use al-Bukhari as his resource? Well, he would have had that access, but he didn't. So later you could see Shafi'i was the person to learn from the different sites. We're going to go back to the different eras, and then we're going to get to the other part. All right. So scholars from, like I said, we got to look at those political situations to see, well, what really happened and how did those influences take place. And now we go for the scholar stance. The scholar stance relied frequently on narrations of hadith, of course, during whatever they had access to. The scholars from different schools, they basically compiled the legal rulings of the most prominent jurists, the prominent jurists that were there, and of course the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. The Tabi'een many of them were still there, but then the following generation goes a little more complex, because when we're looking at the situation in where there was not the same type of access, and the political situation was looking different, and there was a need to canonize and compile the different rulings that were already mentioned by the earlier scholars. So now, with that being said, now you're starting to see certain schools teaching in certain areas, and that was later taught to the other students, and now it's starting to get written down. Writing those fatwa down and using the different evidences was now making fiqh. Islamic thought is now starting to take an independent shape by using independent, or at least a foundation that had a certain basis. Each school started forming its own madhab. Now, the word madhab actually comes from the root dhahaba, which means to go. In other words, the word madhab would actually mean that it is a masdar right here. Madhab would mean that it is a route that somebody the route that somebody had taken, the path that somebody or a group of people had taken, but never to mistake and think that this route is similar to the route of different denominations in Christianity. No, this is not similar at all, because the madhab, they all agreed on the main basis, which is Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas. At least for Qiyas, well, you've got Ibrahim and Nizam, and also um, Zahiriya did not approve that, but that's a different discussion. Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', those were the main resources that they were going to. So that came in where it started getting that we've got the writ trace, we've got the basis, we share the same exact basis, but we have a different way of interpreting things. So that different interpretation became a different route, a different path. That later became the word madhab. We go and we take that path in interpreting this text. They go back to the same text, but they have a different way of understanding it. They have a different way. Each and every single madhab had a different way of perceiving that text. Fiqh became organized. Scholars were right now teaching their students, and the students were documenting things down, and they were teaching it to other students. And right now it became more of a sect, that it became a path that a group of people were using in order to teach it. And then it became that usul and the furu'. The difference between usul and furu'. When we speak of usul, the word usul means fundamentals. So the fundamentals in where, what are the resources that you go back to in order to consider a specific Islamic ruling. So now it studies the resources, and not only the resources, but how you interpret the use of that resource, not how you interpret the resource, because interpreting the wording, the actual wording, that's fiqh, not usul. But how you make use of that resource, this is called usul. Let's give an example. When we say, well, as what is the ruling on wudu? What is the ruling on wudu? You will say, well, let's go back to the scholars of usul. The scholars of usul are going to tell me, okay, in order for you to say that wudu is obligatory or not, you need to go back to Quran and Sunnah. We say, all right, I went back to the Quran and Sunnah. What do you want me to do now? They'll say, okay, do you see an order? Do you see an imperative verb in there? We say, yeah, it actually says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا. They said, okay, does it say فاغسلوا? Do you see an imperative verb in there? We say, yes, we see فاغسلوا. This is an imperative amr verb. They say, okay, do you see any other qarina, any other word or context that makes that imperative verb from being an obligation to being a recommendation? So we look at the ayah and we say, well, no, we don't find anything. So then they'll say, okay, an order means an obligation. An order means an obligation. So then the person that is specialized in fiqh, they'll be the ones to learn from al-usul, from the scholars of fundamentals of fiqh, on how to derive rulings from the text. You see the difference? On how to derive rulings from the text. So then you had every single madhab, I hope you guys don't get lost, every single madhab had its usul and had its furu' and had its details, had the fundamental side, the foundation they go back to, and had the details. How do I actually make a ruling? How do I decide what the ruling is. Now, the entire Sunnah was collected and recorded in the books of Hadith, and that was a very important transition. You had a lot of, you could see 132 to 339 to 339 Hijrah. So this is pretty much the Abbasid era. Well, actually before, because Abbasid era is 656, but the mid era of Abbasid era. So we're looking at 132 to 339. That was the most golden era. That was the golden era for Hadith compilation. This is the era in where they were collecting the Hadith, etc. And that became a very important resource for the schools of fiqh. The schools of fiqh were right now, you know, having all these rich resources that they can go back to in order to consider something authentic or not. But guess what? Even that, you still had a problem we'll get to later. The scholars from different parts of the world have taken it upon themselves. They would collect the hadith. The madhahib were spread about based on the students and the travel. But there was another part. There was a government support. Now, the government or certain governments would then embrace a canonized fiqh. What does that mean? So certain governments, to make it easy for them, instead of every single time going to a specific or going instead of going to a specific scholar, it was easier for them to go to a canonized madhab, to consider and embrace a path of scholars, a group of scholars, in order to regard that as, more of like a legislature or constitution. So that became that government support, which later helped in the spread of that particular madhab, because it was adopted by the government. It was adopted by the government to the point that it was many times enforcing and even financing the schools that were teaching this. It was considered an honor. It was considered a resource. It was considered like the government is doing its job in teaching Islam. But of course, it was going to be a specific madhab. You're going to have to follow a certain group. So that's why it's very important to look at that and how later it developed. But you want to keep in mind that scholars were learning from one another. Shafi'i learns from Imam Malik. Ahmad ibn Hanbal learns from Shafi'i. Here's a fast story that always fascinates me. Listen to the story. The story goes as follows. Imam Shafi'i, his name was Muhammad ibn Idris. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i lived, or at least was born in Gaza. Yeah, Gaza, Palestine. Yep, was born in Gaza. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, his own father, dies when he was only 2 years old. But mother couldn't take care of her own child. So she decides to head back all the way to Mecca, where his uncles and his family had lived. But they did see that Muhammad ibn Idris, this young boy al-Shafi'i, was very bright. So they send him off to the tribe of Bani Hudayl. The tribe of Bani Hudayl, they were the tribe that were living, Bani Hudayl, they're actually the tribe of Halima Sa'diyah and those, all right? So, or at least they lived near them, all right? The tribe of Bani Hudayl, they were the Bedouin, very simple, and they were living off away from the city. And it was considered, just like during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that you're sending off your child away from the pollution, away from all the different ujmat al-lisan, not having that correct, authentic Arabic speech and etc. So they would send them to the tribe of Bani Hudayl. And the tribe of Bani Hudayl, they spoke very classical Arabic, simply because they were away from the different influences in the city of Mecca. Young boy Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i even learned the Quran there At the age of 7, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i memorizes the Quran entirely. Not only that, but he even memorizes poetry that was said by Qabilat Bani Hudayl, by the tribe of Bani Hudayl, to the point that Al-Asma'i, a major scholar in Lugha Arabiya, he actually says, I corrected the poetry of Bani Hudayl based on a young child from Fatan min Quraysh, a young child from Quraysh. His name is Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i was the main person to pass on this information and not only learn poetry and Quran, but later. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i grows at age 9. He was already a major person learning all the fiqh that was taught in Mecca. So the mayor in Mecca decides that it was time to have this young boy, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, graduate from Mecca and actually go somewhere else where other renowned scholars are actually going to be. So the mayor of Mecca writes a note and sends it to the mayor of Medina to go to the mayor of Medina and to be with Imam Malik. Now, this one was a very tough request. It was, for the first time in history, a 9-year-old boy was actually going to go and sit in the most advanced school, and that was, at the time, Imam Malik's school. Imam Malik was already facing his own challenges with the government. So Imam Malik, the mayor of Medina, goes to Imam Malik's home, along with many of his ministers and many of his important figures in his government, goes to Imam Malik's home. Goes, knocks at the door. His servant comes out. Yes, sir, how can I help you? I need to speak with Imam Malik. Okay, just wait here. I'll come back out. She goes. Imam Malik tells her, tell him. And who is him? Him is the mayor. Tell him if he has a question to ask, he can write the question and send it in, and we'll be sure to send back the response. But if he wants to learn, he knows our halaqah times, and he could attend during those times. So she goes, and the mayor says, no, I've got a different issue that I'd like to speak to him about. So she goes inside and gets out and puts out a chair. Imam Malik comes out. And here it is, the note that Mecca's mayor had sent, that this boy, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, who was present, was right now going to be was going to be learning at Imam Malik's school. But this required a scholarship, this required a reference, this required a government order and permission. So Imam Malik looks at the note and then looks at Imam al-Shafi'i, this 9-year-old boy, and says, Ya fata, ittaqillah fasayakunu laka sha'nun azim. Oh young boy, have taqwa. You're going to be a major person, going to be a leader. He saw through his eyes that he was more than just a young boy. He was going to be a leader. Imam al-Shafi'i is then told that he must memorize the book of Al-Muwatta. Al-Muwatta is the hadith book that contains hadith and contains athar, meaning Sahaba and Tabi'een quotes, and it is almost in approximately 700 pages. Imam al-Shafi'i, in order to continue going to that school, he says, well, I need you. Imam Malik tells him, you need to memorize al-Muwatta before you join our class. Imam Shafi'i memorizes the whole Muwatta, 700-page book of Hadith, in 9 days only. In 9 days only, he memorizes it cover to cover, then joins and learns from Imam Malik. They learn from one another, and later, even Ahmad ibn Hanbal learns from Shafi'i. They were not at all antagonists. They were not at all at war with each other, but they were understanding that they were all going and wanting to learn from the same resource. A lot to say, and right now it's 6:02 already. But I hope we at least learn and keep that story in your mind. And I know that most of the people attending are mothers, but what do we want to teach our children? And what do we take from the story of Shafi'i? It's one of my favorite stories. So we'll end right here, and next week we'll continue. I thought we will cover more slides, but hopefully we can benefit from those things that we had said earlier. We'll talk about next week, inshallah. We'll talk about it, Dawla Abbasiyya, which is pretty much, that era. Well, this isn't the totally Dawla Abbasiyya, because Dawla Abbasiyya started 132, but this is at least mid Dawla Abbasiyya, the mid Abbasid era, and how that impacted and how that influenced the evolution of Muslim thinking and where it went. And when we speak about fiqh, of course, we're going to talk about the era of madhab. When we speak about the era of madhab, so does that mean I have to follow certain madhab? We're going to learn about some of those personal scholars and their resources, and some things to learn from. This is my field, so when I go in there, when I speak about fiqh, you just see me just all of a sudden delving in, and I lose my, what is the word that I could say, but I lose myself. I just go inside and I forget about everything. I forget everything about me. I just love speaking about fiqh, and I just go inside, and it all of a sudden becomes the most nourishing topic that you can talk about. It feels like as if the person is actually swimming. When you eat a very delicious meal, it becomes that thing that you just melt in. When you just melt and you just don't want to end. That's exactly how I feel when I discuss fiqh. So mind me when I go in it, please. Please excuse me when I speak about that and I forget about myself. It's okay to get me on. It's okay to get me on track and tell me, wait, don't go too far, and stay on track. So jazakumullah khairan, everybody. Yeah, I light up when I mention fiqh. That's my favorite topic. All right, so inshallah, we'll continue next week. And jazakumullah khairan, everybody. Stay tuned. We still have a lot more to learn, and these are majalis, these are sessions where in the midst of all this dunya, I used to have one of the students that used to come in during my times when I was teaching at the Islamic University. She would come in with tears filling her eyes, and then she would sit and as if nothing happened. And then once the class finishes, she would go back in tears again. So I said, can you explain to me what happened? And I don't understand why during class you're just okay, and then after class you come back to your tears again. And then she told me, I only come to class because it's my only time for relief. I was really confused. I said, relief? Relief from what? And she said that her husband was an alcoholic, was on drugs, was very abusive, and that she just can't forget about it until she comes to class. She just lives with the class and forgets that situation that she's living in. She finally got divorced from that man, but it's amazing. It's amazing how when we live in it, there's no beautiful thing than talab al-ilm. There's nothing sweeter than a moment to enjoy talking about those that lived for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that lived to learn the words of the Prophet ﷺ, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to do whatever it takes to give up on their dunya for the sake of akhirah. You can fight for anything in dunya, but you want to remember that the Prophet ﷺ said, you can love whoever you want, but you got to remember that one day you're going to separate from them. You can combine the money, all the money that you want, but you got to learn and you got to remember that that money is going to be left behind and you're going to move on in death. And that's the same thing. You can live as long as you want, but there's eventually going to be death. And when we'll study the scholars and their life and what they did, it becomes that inspiration that fills us so that we can learn from them, so we can use them as our role models, especially during a time where we lack the role models. It's so hard to find any role model around you. Almost everybody is either running for position or money or fame. And these people, you will learn from them. And their legacy remains because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will raise those that were on his path. And this is where we see it. Their legacy remained because of the salah, because of the piety, because of the sincerity that they had, because of their love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we could at least live with these people and live with their legacy, live with their ilm, and teach it to others, and us learning from that. And maybe we can move to take them as an example. And jazakumullah khairan, everybody. There's really a lot to say, but khairan inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allah yarda annik, Sister Sana. Allah yabarak fiki. Yes, I will send it. I will upload it on YouTube. And then, subscribe to the YouTube channel, Gems of Light, and you will get the notifications whenever we upload a dars, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.